loved, worthy, whole, all that good stuff. I was always turning to someone or something else for my worth. The steps have helped me be able to turn to Jesus for that. I still at times try to go into self-sufficiency mode, but then I remember it's my way that got me in here. And now I remember and know that it's Jesus and Jesus' way that's gotten me up here talking about things I swore I would never talk about here or anywhere else. The steps that I think touched me the most were 8 and 9, the forgiveness, mainly the rock exercise. Very early in my recovery, I found out that my dad had also molested my daughter. I was vehement about not forgiving him. I felt, for one, that would be betraying her. For two, I didn't feel like he deserved my forgiveness or God's. So when I went to throw my rocks in the river, I wasn't at all convinced that I could throw his or that I even wanted to throw his. At that point, I just kind of went to God and told God that if he expected me to forgive such a horrible crime, such a horrible sin, that he was going to have to show up there in an extremely powerful way that day. And honestly, I didn't think God was up to the challenge. When I finally got to my dad's rock, I wanted to set it aside. I was not yet ready to forgive. But of course, God had different plans. He wanted me to deal with it in the order that I pulled it from the bag. So of course, I started arguing with God, and it was my same argument that I had argued from a year and a half earlier when I first found out. I knew God was willing to forgive me, and therefore I knew he commanded me to forgive others so that I could receive his forgiveness. But my question was, how could he ask me and expect me to forgive such a horrible sin as someone molesting my baby? It wasn't fair. And again, my reasoning to him was, I have never done anything so horrible as to molest somebody else's baby. So how can you really expect me to be able to do this? How is it fair? But then in a kind, gentle, loving manner, I was reminded that I had killed one of his babies. I wept, and I wept, and I wept. And they weren't tears of guilt, but instead this time they were tears of freedom. Freedom from all of the guilt that I had carried around with me for so long. I knew for the first time that God could forgive me, he would forgive me, and that he could help me to forgive my dad. So he did show up that day. And I can't say that I have completely forgiven my dad yet, but I am willing to forgive him, and I do pray for him, and I also pray for God to give me a forgiving heart. So see, this was the first time that I'd realized God wasn't asking any more from me than what he had given me. Steps 4 and 5 were also really big for me. I was able to see where I had a part in the things that other people had done to hurt me. I was also able to take responsibility for the things I had done to hurt others for the first time. I'd been so used to thinking of myself as the victim from everyone else, that I had been used and abused and everything else from others. And this step really helped me be able to realize that I was the one that had used others to try to make myself feel worthy, to feel loved and whole. I never cared if I was hurting any of them or anyone else outside of them. In fact, if anyone even showed any indication of feelings, I ran the other way. Feelings to me were very vulnerable, and vulnerability was a huge weakness. And that is something that I did not equate with me. I was tough, I could do it on my own, I didn't need anybody, and I didn't want anybody. What a lie. But that's how I saw it. I also found healing in the instances of abuse. My grandparents, my mom's dad and stepmom, molested me through my childhood, but I'd never called it what it was. I don't know why. I guess the type of touching it was, not being penetration. But I'd never called it that. So this was the first time I was able to call it that and find healing. I was also able to find healing surrounding the times I was raped at 13 and 14 rather than carrying the guilt from that. So now I'm learning to trust God in my fear of rejection, failure, and abandonment. I don't run from feelings and emotions like I used to. I do desire close and meaningful relationships with people. It's still very scary for me, but I'm working on it. I don't equate vulnerability with weakness any longer. And I don't let my fear of rejection, failure, and abandonment color everything I do and say. I used to be so sure that people were going to reject me that I'd do or say or whatever I needed to ensure it, to make sure it was going to happen. For one, then I could blame them and feel sorry for myself. Kept me living in my self-pity. I no longer believe the lie that nobody could ever love me or like me. And I'm also learning to recognize my part in things rather than always just blaming someone else. At this point, I am totally committed to living my life for Christ. I was finally baptized last November, and it was awesome. I'd been wanting to be baptized since I was young, but once I got old enough to make that decision and do that on my own, I no longer felt worthy. So this was huge for me. And really, it's just that I realized two things. Number one, it wasn't about me. Number two, that God did desire me and want a relationship with me. So the first time in my life, I actually know who I am, and I'm a child of God. So all I can say is anyone thinking about making the commitment to do the steps, do it. You won't regret it. I can face each day now without having something to hide behind. This is the first time since I was 14, with the exception of my pregnancies, that I have been clean from everything. I have learned to not believe the lies that I'm not loved, that I'm not worthy, and that I could never change. I have changed, and I am loved. I have learned to not fight surrendering, but to embrace it. I know I can't do it on my own, and I know I need God. Just like the tax collector in the story in Luke 18:10 through 14. In this story, the Pharisee is thanking God that he's not like all those other men that are sinners out there, like the tax collector. He's also prideful about the fact that he fasts twice a week and gives 1/10 of all he gets. The tax collector, on the other hand, won't even look to heaven as he's praying. He asks God to have mercy on him, and he admits that he's a sinner. So in this, Jesus tells us that the proud will be humbled, but the humble will be honored. One last verse I'd like to share is Proverbs 28:13. It tells us, "He who conceals his own sins does not prosper, but whoever confesses and renounces them finds mercy." I know we've all heard it here a million times. You're only as sick as your secrets. One other thing we're told quite a bit, don't quit until the miracle happens for you. That's all I have.